highlighted that in order to achieve a long-term development, historical growth strategies must evolve and adapt to the current and future realities. Decentralized government was identified as a crucial factor for achieving this goal. But how do we achieve this? The answer may lie in building trust, which could be a crucial ingredient for attaining this goal. So before we begin, let me please give a few details that the session will be 90 minutes long, and we encourage all the participants to post their questions in the chat at any point of time. And the moderator will be collecting them for the panel to answer at the end of the session. And if you have any technical requirement or problem, please contact us via the chat. So the second session, our expert panel will shed the light on mobilizing trust, policy making for equity. And our moderator for session 2 is Mr. Ameya Naik, who's a senior manager at e-government and a faculty member at the Takshashila Institute. I hand it over now to you, Mr. Naik.
Thanks, Farheen, and welcome everyone to the second session of this colloquium. Thanks to Farheen also for recapping what the first session in the morning discussed. I think two other points that stood out for me from that discussion was that the journey towards development requires states, markets, and societies to work together on many, many things. And that it is in fact a long journey that only a handful of countries have really can really claim to have made it all the way, and that most of us are still in progress. So with that as the backdrop, it's great to have this panel where we can go into specifically the role of trust. How does it relate to how these sectors perceive each other? How do they work with each other? We are lucky to be joined by three amazing speakers for this discussion. Let me introduce them in the order that they will be speaking. So we have Dr. Siddharth Tiwari, who is Associate Fellow in the Global Economy and Finance Program at Chatham House. I think I'm hearing a bit of an echo. Sorry, Dr. Tiwari, you were saying something? Okay, your audio is a bit faint for me. I'm not sure if anyone else on the call is having that issue.
No, I think it is a bit faint.
Can you hear me?
Much better now. Thank you so much.
Okay.
I was saying we're joined by Dr. Siddharth Tiwari. He's Associate Fellow in the Global Economy and Finance Program at Chatham House and a Vice President at the International Finance Forum. He recently advised the Indian Sherpa during India's G20 presidency at the International Finance Forum in Beijing, the International Finance Forum, please excuse me. Dr. Tiwari has a master's from the London School of Economics and a PhD in economics from the University of Chicago. He has a long and illustrious career. I am editorializing the CV in the interest of getting to his remarks quicker. We are also joined by Dr. Amogh Rai. He is the Director of Research at Asia, our organizers today, and visiting faculty at JNU. He's a provost of SGT University and formerly was a consultant to the World Bank. His research expertise spans health, environment, inequality, behavioral economics. Among other projects, he worked on setting up the Atal Community Innovation Centers as part of the Atal Innovation Mission and with Niti Aayog in India. And we are joined by Dr. Clara Mattei, who is an associate professor in the economics department at the New School for Social Research. Her book, The Capital Order, was awarded the Herbert Baxter Adams Prize from the American Historical Association. Dr. Mattei has a PhD in economics from Santa Ana Institute for Advanced Studies and the University of Strasbourg. Welcome to all of our speakers. We're delighted to have you here with us. Without further ado, let me invite Dr. Tiwari to speak. I will remind you at about the 10-minute mark that you might want to start winding up your comments in another 2 minutes or so there.
Okay, thank you so much for convening this panel. And really, there are many ways to interpret the title of the session, which is Mobilizing Trust, Policymaking for Equity, where we are asked to explore how establishing trust between state, market, and civil society is pivotal. In my remarks today, I'm going to draw upon my experience over the decades in global policymaking. In particular, I want to focus on three issues: what has worked, second, what has changed and why it has changed, and third, what is needed. So as we look back over the last 80 years, it is clear that multilateralism has helped enable periods of high growth fueled by the expansion of globalization in goods, in services, information flows, people-to-people exchanges, which benefited large parts of the global population. While crises did occur in this time, they were dealt with by national authorities with the support of the global system. With the economic pie growing, many countries benefited, and large swaths of the global population were lifted out of poverty. China and India, two leading examples of this transformation. Now, this did not happen without challenges, as globalization deepened parts of the population that were displaced, had fewer employment opportunities. And this was true both in advanced economies and middle and low-income countries, with negative consequences for income and also for social cohesion. This led to a weakening of the multilateral system, but the system did push forward in bringing people out of poverty. So the next question is, what has changed? And I think it's fair to say here that if you look at the last 5 years, two developments stand out. One, the crisis in the global commons has dominated crisis worldwide and has a profound negative effect on the world economy. I think there's broad-based agreement amongst policymakers today that effective management of the global commons represents the most significant and the most pressing challenge facing both national authorities and multilateral institutions. And just two examples here, we've all lived through it. First, the pandemic that led to a tragic loss of millions of lives. It led to a widening of the education divide, where when schools were closed, led to lost future earnings of the estimates of around 17 trillion. The defenses around the virus proved weak, and the sharing of the vaccines did not happen. And then is what we are living through today is climate. It's existential threat posed to humanity. And it's becoming increasingly evident that fossil fuel consumption is rising instead of declining, and immediate replacements are not at hand. Climate crisis, I think most people would say, has reached a tipping point, and if left unchecked, will lead to famines, floods, fires, and migration. And both of these developments in the last 5 years have fundamentally eroded the hard-won gains in health, education, productivity. And I think most people would agree that most 18, 90% of the sustainable development goals are now out of reach. So that's one trend that has happened. The second trend is that despite the agreement that action is needed, substantive progress in these challenges has been slow. In particular, the public and the private sector have not been able to mobilize the frameworks, the resources to deal with the global commons. And why has this changed? I think one way to look at it is that the current international architecture designed in the aftermath of the Second World War was structured primarily around individual nations. As it was designed, the existing architecture has been successful in dealing with both in-country and perhaps regional challenges. However, it's demonstrated a severe limitation to managing the crisis of the commons. No single country is responsible for the crisis, and no single country can redress the situation either. In addition, no institution has a mandate to worry about it, let alone solve it. The inability of the global architecture to act in time and in scale has its roots in two important facets that are moving in parallel today. The first facet is that the challenges to the commons are becoming more numerous and more pressing. While climate is perhaps the most pressing issue at hand, there are many other demanding challenges in the commons, whether it's health, whether it's trade, whether it is technology, whether it's environmental issues. They go on and on as challenges. And the second plank that is moving forward is that the global economy has become more fragmented, and geopolitical tensions have increased, making collective action very difficult. The tailwinds to growth, which was the first part that I referred to, such as growing markets, increasing trade, expanding supply chains, financial globalization, they were all disrupted by the pandemic. The war in Ukraine ruptured the rules that govern international order. International cooperation is perhaps at its lowest point since the end of the Cold War. The peace dividend has evaporated as defense spending has increased. And the increase in geopolitical tensions has led to a retreat in terms of leading to a rush for energy and food security, nearshoring of supply chains, and adoption of protectionist policies. Strategic competition, geopolitical tensions, and the knock-on effects of armed conflicts are exacerbating the risk of fragmentation. And I think it's fair to say in the initial phase, multilateralism and globalization were intertwined. Since then, globalization is here to stay, but multilateralism has been severely dented. So I asked the question, what is needed? By now, it's clear that what is needed is more rather than less multilateralism. But what's also needed is institutions or policy making that fulfills 7 criteria. One, that institutions need to have global membership and an agreed set of norms and standards to which all countries subscribe. In other words, they need to be inclusive and rules-based. Second, they must have legitimate and effective voice to both establish and defend the norms. Third, they need to articulate a clear view of the situation and play a guardian role, providing, importantly, a platform to those less represented and deeply affected by the problems. Fourth, they need to ensure compliance with norms and have the courage to speak truth to power. 5, work with other institutions. 6, they need to be respected for their expertise. And 7th, finally, they should have the financial resources to do their task. while I've talked about the international framework, everything I've said applies as much to national institutions. The same can be said of a Supreme Court in a country. It can be said of institutions that manage the electoral process. And I could go on in national policy making, but I've hit my 10-minute mark, and so I'm going to stop here and then come back later after the other speakers have spoken. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Tiwari. Thank you also for keeping scrupulously to time. With that, let me invite Dr. Rai to speak, please.
Thank you. Thank you for sort of giving me the opportunity to speak. So I'm going to begin with a quote from Kenneth Arrow, and it is a quote on trust. Virtually every commercial transaction has within itself an element of trust, certainly any transaction conducted over a period of time. Now, trust is an enabler of transactions. It is also an enabler of economic growth, spread across and spanning a huge time frame. But trust in the last 10, 15 years, there are international bodies that measure it. And one specific question that has been asked time in and time out in the global population: do you believe that most people can be trusted? Now, there's a very interesting finding. This proportion of people who can trust the other person, that it has fallen by almost 20 to 22, 23% over the last 17, 18 years. And on the face of it, why should it be a matter of concern that this is happening? And what does this trust has to do with economic growth and equity? But it is not all that simple. And this is the point that I've come to make here. When we look at economic growth, we tend to look at a gloomier picture that has been presented to us post 2008. But if we go back, there was a time when institutions converged, and that converging institution, in 2020, an economist called Steve Marklin has connected it to how our institutions function. The 30-year period from the end of the war that Dr. Tiwari also spoke about to 1970-75 was the period that came about because of a very happy admixture of economics and politics. At the time, you had social democracy movement, you had the New Deal, and had a kind of politics which was helping to shape up institutions that were focused and forward-looking. They were not just enveloped in the marginal revolution. So in these institutions, you created the perfect mixture for economic growth, which was also looking at the last person. Slowly and steadily, there was a consensus that was built up that perhaps there is another way of delivering economic growth. That delivering of economic growth led to a certain school, which became very important in the economic orthodoxy, which led to a lot of problems in how institutions were structured, be it regulatory institutions, be it government institutions, be it judicial institutions. And that brings me to March of 2024. While I was preparing for these short remarks, I came across, and I'm fascinated by the Pew Research and the amount of information they put out on trust. Sometime in the mid-March of 2024, Pew brought people from 24 countries on the survey platform and asked 30,000 people, what do they think can be done for making democracy or institutions work better? The results were surprising. Just about everybody said that perhaps the politics has to change. There were, I think, out of the 30 countries, only 4 countries talked about economic reform. That was South Africa. So South Africa and India were the 2 countries that talked about economic reform as this one giant piece in the puzzle that would make democracies more effective. And Poland talked about change in leadership, and then Israel talked about judicial system. But just about everywhere else, it was politicians. This missing piece in the puzzle, when we talk about economic growth now, we are often left with a very contradictory message. Everybody is focused on economic growth to be rooted in their country performing better. However, support for multilateral institutions, support for regulatory oversight, support for non-technocratic measures that can be measured specifically in a unit of time are going down, time in and time out. This overt rationalization and technocracy is one of the red flags that perhaps we have to pay more attention to. The second point, agreeing largely with what Dr. Tiwari has talked about in the global commons landscape, but pointing out that when we talk about multilateral institutions, the ideals of the multilateral institutions sometimes do not quite translate very well to effective near-term engagements of the citizenry. And this is something that cannot be addressed just by the state. In the series of conversations that we do in Asia, we had a former bureaucrat, former diplomat of the Indian Foreign Services, and he made a very interesting statement. He said, the state is back. And this is a statement, when I reflect on it, just about every other pillar in the economic growth puzzle has now ceded way to the state. And the state decides for itself that it is the most credible institutional mechanism which deserves of the citizenry trust. How do we solve this? One way is by voting in and voting out governments. But time in and time out, we are seeing that states, especially very well-working democracies, are looking very eagerly on the other side and thinking about authoritarian rule being much better. So that's one puzzle. How do we actually fix out our elective procedures? Second, and I think Dr. Tiwari made a very interesting point about it in terms of climate change. So there are 2 large problems that we're looking at. One, we have an oversized state structure, which is dependent on a very interesting black box, which is algorithms. Now, these algorithms are beyond the control of not just state, but any of the other multilateral organizations. So when we talk about trust and when we talk about equity, the paradox of trusting an institution which does not take feedback and which can only be replaced at a certain point of time, and where the citizenry is finding itself hard-pressed to figure out what exactly is going on. And none of us have to go long way back in history to think about it. Just go back 4 years ago. Look at almost all of the challenges that came out inherently. Had we been doing this in 2020, then we would be talking about how in the West, the big tech companies were doing contact tracing, how in India or countries in the global south were trying to do contact tracing through the street mechanism. A lot of lip service is being paid by the economists, and I am an economist, so I can say this, when it comes to rapidly deploying trust in a larger sense. But when we talk about trust in the new digital economy, it is something that we have not figured out. Because perhaps almost, it is almost like our 19th and 20th century models do not quite work in the extreme economic landscapes that we find ourselves in. If I have time, I would like to just make one point. So do I have time, or have I exhausted it?
You hit your 10-minute mark, so you have 2 to 3 minutes to cover.
No, so I'll just give you sort of a couple of sort of how. So what Pew did this time, they actually went to people, but instead of just collecting survey, they also tried getting out some stories. So for representation, a 30-year-old woman in Australia says, bring in more diverse voices rather than mostly wealthy white men. But at the same time, a man in India says that, I don't really care until unless the economic reforms are delivered. But then you have a 72-year-old woman in Germany who says that our politicians should have an education corresponding to their subject or field. And at the same time, there are things for systemic reform, there are things for judicial reform and government reform. There are things about technological reform. And in all of this, it is very hard to find out who is trying to connect all of the pieces together and look at trust in the democratic institutions, because without that, we'll be backsliding into anarchy. And perhaps one of the key takeaways from the previous session was that all of these 3 institutions have to come together to deliver growth at scale. But when you're staring at climate change, one has to have credible trust to identify what would this economic growth at scale would mean. Thank you very much. I hope I've kept my remarks within the time frame.
I think striking quote at the start on how trust is needed for things to play out over time, and then coming to how trust is multifactorial with the stories that you were sharing at the end. I now invite Professor Mattei to speak. Over to you.
Thank you. Yes,
there we
thank
go.
you.
Now we hear you.
Can you hear me? Great. Okay. Thank you for having me. I would like to, in a way, look a little bit more critically at the idea that it is enough for states to promote economic growth in order to actually achieve the solutions to the catastrophic contradictions and problems that our societies are facing right now. And these problems are global, and they are all in the same direction. They were mentioned well by Dr. Tiwari. Apart from the climate catastrophe that is looming, we are seeing the worst inequality tragedy, a tragedy of the commons, and incapacity to actually build infrastructures that are accessible and not excluding the majority of the people. I would like to remind you that as of March 2023, the World Bank data tells us that there's 659 million people that are living below $2.5 a day. there is half the world population that is living with less than $6.85 a day. These are incredible numbers. An image out of all of the failure of our society, I think, is what we see in Mumbai, in which there is the most expensive house in the world, Antilia, which 27 stories and ballrooms and helicopter landing spots, while there's more than 40,000 children without a home living in the streets of the same city. We are talking of not an economy in general here. We're talking specifically about a capitalist economy. So I do believe that in this historical moment in which the explosions of the incapacities of our societies to actually self-govern in a democratic and inclusive way has to lead economists to be more courageous in exploring what are actually the problems that have led to this state of affairs. Now, this is why it's important to discuss capitalist growth, because capitalist growth is not meant and never was meant to deliver equitable outcomes. When we talk about capitalist growth, what we mean is that resources are invested if there is an expectations for making a profit. And by definition, this profit making, this extra money from the money you started off with, is completely detached from the use value. It's about the realization of exchange value. It does not matter for entrepreneurs if they invest in Tesla cars or trash bags. What happens is that capital moves where the expectations for profit are higher. We see that this means that we have to stop idealizing the market as an institution that is best suited to efficiently satisfy people's needs. Markets and needs have very little in common as the logic. The logic of the market is the logic of the realization of profit, in which there is constant real competition amongst private actors to realize a profit, given that there is no plan, but there is full anarchy. And everyone is trying to beat the competitors. Anwar Sheikh, my very important colleague who wrote a very important book called Capitalism, Competition, Conflict, Crisis, really tries to provide economists with a different theoretical framework to more realistically and more compellingly understand why is it that our society is facing such harsh humanitarian disasters. Not to speak, of course, of what we're seeing right now happening in Gaza, that is not separable from the running of our economy, right? The fact that right now we are seeing complete violation of any forms of international law and the murder of thousands of children, almost 15,000 children, and just starvation used as a weapon of war, this is not separable from economic issues. So my call here is for economists to really rethink the toolbox they're used to. Really start questioning, is economic growth really the measure and the objective that we should thrive for? Or what does this economic growth mean? Because again, it's not an economic growth in general, it's specifically capitalist economic growth, with the detachment, and not just the detachment, but also the fact that capitalist economic growth relies structurally on what classical political economy calls exploitation, meaning the fact that the majority on the globe, including in advanced countries such as the one I live in, okay, the majority of the population provides and is the source of much more value for the economy with respect to what one gets in the paycheck, okay? So the structural amount of extra value that we count as economic growth is actually the result of the fact fundamentally that people are not paid of unpaid labor, meaning that the amount of value you produce during your day that you do not get to keep because it's technically of your employer is much more than the one you get in your paycheck, right? This is does not matter how much you get paid, it matters the distance between what you get paid and the value you produced. So if we understand economic growth under capitalism as based on exploitation, we understand that our system, it is structurally incompatible with substantial economic democracy. And this has to be understood clearly. What I try to do in my work is to actually point out to the fact that what are usually understood as problems for human beings, namely unemployment, precarity, inequality, are in fact solutions for our economic system. The economic system, according to its logic, is not in crisis. The profit rates have never been so high right now. Okay, if you look at the data, profits are doing very well. The system is doing very well according to its own logic. The problem is that the logic of the system is incompatible with the logic of human fulfillment. And this is something that economists, of course, have tried to avoid saying. And of course, we know that the type of toolbox derives from a very specific tradition in economics, which is clearly not the tradition of critical classical political economy of the founding fathers of the discipline. For example, Smith, Ricardo, and Marx. Now, in this respect, the concept that trust can be sufficient to solve the problems, I think, is unfortunately quite a naive point of view. I think in order for trust to be meaningful in an economy, we need to rethink the fundamentals of this economy. And I think this is where the struggle of the moment needs to lie. Put, in fact, the safeguard and the taking care of the commons as the center of our interest. Democratically planning for serious infrastructural shifts to safeguard the planet. Serious amount of policies that actually distribute resources to the people. These are all policies that are counter to the logic of capitalism, right? So if we want to push for these policies, we need to understand that it is about a political struggle. What I teach my students is there's no economic problem that is not also deeply political. So if we actually want to change the direction of our society, we need to be prepared to have the political will to completely change those that are the priorities of market capitalist-driven economies. And this, for me, is really, really crucial. Now, in my studies, I've focused on austerity to show how austerity is indeed not just an exception of the so-called neoliberal phase of capitalism, but how austerity is instead in the DNA of our economic system. It is structural to it. And why is it structural to it? It's because the states and other economic institutions, economic political institutions, have to constantly, actively maintain capitalism intact, or better, the fundamental social relations that allow for capitalist growth intact. So the title of the book that I wrote, that is called The Capital Order, really stresses that capital, again, as GDP growth, as material improvement, is based in our society on capital as the social relation by which the majority, once more, has no alternative but to fundamentally give up on agency during their workday and give up the output of the labor. Now, if the capital order is indeed the foundation of our current society, this means that it is highly fragile because the majority is losing. So what you see is that far from being a spontaneous system, a system that is based on some form of human inherent human nature. And this is what we learn at school, that somehow capitalism mirrors who we really are as rational maximizers. If we take history seriously, we realize that actually capitalism is not only anti-democratic, it is also fundamentally a sickly economics that is very, very weak and fragile. And this is why it needs constant protection from the part of political institutions, from the part of governments, through austerity measures. And what austerity ultimately does is shift resources away from people. Cuts in social expenditures, cuts in all forms of housing, education, school, healthcare, you name it. This serves to increase our market dependence, to make the majority more vulnerable, more trapped in economic coercion, while incentivizing the few savers investors. So fiscal austerity goes, of course, with monetary austerity, the fact that interest rates are going up, and this ultimately is something that is portrayed as the neutral measure to solve inflation. We very much know instead that it is a solution that hits the working people because the working people lose their jobs and once more become more vulnerable to the capital order. And finally, forms of industrial austerity, so constant privatization and deregulation of labor. I know I have just a couple more minutes left, so I just would like to say that this austerity trinity that I studied historically is once more not a policy mistake, unfortunately, but very, very crucial for the maintenance of the capital order. So if we understand how capitalism is not only anti-human, but not natural, and we understand how it has been actively maintained in place by policies that have extracted resources from the people in order to incentivize the few winners of our economic system. And of course, the winners exist. And this is why ultimately there's such great rhetoric and theory to justify the current socioeconomic system. But if we understand that austerity is fundamental to the system, we also understand that if we want to actually promote serious social transformation, we need to be more courageous than simply asking for greater trust, because this trust can be substantive only if we find ways to govern our society that are actually democratic and inclusive. So self-management of workers, the rehabilitation of the commons as a space to collectively and democratically plan for the catastrophes that as humanity collectively we're facing. So I hope in a way that the fact that, for example, I will be directing a new center for heterodox economics in Tulsa, Oklahoma from next year, that we will in a way construct a new network of critical scholars in order to really think imaginatively about an alternative future that once more needs and requires courageous theoretical grounding. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Mattei. I think one of the things that you said that resonated strongly with me is at Takshila also, where we teach, the one thing we tell our students is there is no policy without politics. And so certainly I think that's, whether that is economic policy or we broaden the canvas, that will remain true. I think what I'd like to do now is I have a couple of questions that I'd like to pose to each of the panelists. I'll start with one, however, would like to invite people on the call to put their questions into chat. I think we've gotten one so far. Please do add, and you know, if you ask something that I find even more compelling than anything I want to ask, I will skip my second question and go to the one that you put in the chat instead. If not, we're still going to come to questions in the chat about 20-25 minutes down the line. The speakers, I'll request you to respond to questions in this round in, say, 3 to 5 minutes. The first one, and I have to reconfigure this slightly based on what Professor Mattei said in her remarks, right? But I think you know, how do I frame this? So when I was studying for my LLM, what I studied was transitional justice, which is the field that looks at how the rule of law and institutions are restored in the aftermath of armed conflict. And armed conflict is sort of the most severe instance, right? It's a profound rupture in the normal political and social order. Even allowing for contestation, even allowing for exploitation, we don't necessarily see armed conflict in most places in the world at most points of time. Even short of conflict, though, we can see various situations. So I'm thinking of some of the polling data that Professor Rai was talking about that tell us that the social contract is breached or is at least perceived by many people to be breached, which is in some ways the same thing, right? And so the question I have for you is, what do you think is necessary and or possible for repairing or restoring the social contract? If you prefer to read that as renegotiating the social contract, go ahead and take it down that line as well. Shall we stick to the same order for this question, please? So Dr. Tiwari, Dr. Rai, Dr. Mattei, in that order.
Okay, so I think just reflecting on what everyone said and thinking about what has changed. The social contract that large part of the world signed on to was, broadly speaking, not exactly, broadly speaking, two things. One, capitalism, which was supposed to provide equality of opportunities, and democracy, that was supposed to provide equality of outcomes. And how this goes hand in hand was, I think if you look at the 40s, 50s, 60s, there was a movement in this direction where inequality did not increase, more people were educated, there was a social contract that went forward. The market still directed resources because no state has ever chosen a winner. The market still directed resources, but that was curtailed, that the return to capital and the return to labor was balanced. And so we went through a period where risk-taking in the financial markets did not dominate risk-taking in the real economy. And much of that has got changed in the last 15 years, 20 years. If you look at the 2008 crisis, or even if you look at the pandemic, the interventions from the state that happened at all levels were all intended to increase the production or increase the real economy, and it didn't. Essentially, there was risk-taking in the financial markets. And if you layer this on top with the emergence of large tech companies that have pervaded every aspect of the corporate world. I'll just give you an example. I used to live in Hong Kong till a year back. The last 8 banking licenses that were given in Hong Kong, which is a major financial center, have gone to big tech companies, have not gone to traditional banks, and there are several traditional banks there. And this is a area that has been neglected in terms of what these companies are doing. I'll give you an example. The largest 10 Fortune 500 companies are data companies. It's the first time in human existence I see where someone who's a creator of value, meaning me, you, all of us on the screen, who've created our data, have no clue where the data resides. have no clue when it is traded, and have no clue have no access or no benefit from the use of that data. So what I see as a big divide here is in terms of what we initially started out as the aim of capitalism and the aim of democracy, that twining of these two paths has broken. And whether it can be repaired, I think the bigger challenge is, can it be repaired with the onset of big tech companies? And that's a completely different conversation. I'll stop here.
Thank you, Dr. Tiwari. You, if anything, amplified and made my question more complex. But that's, let's see if either of the following speakers want to take on those aspects as well. Dr. Rai, please.
Thank you, Dr. Naik. So essentially, sort of adding to the point that I was making earlier on, to answer your question very briefly, I think the social contract has to be brought to what the Americans call the sort of the surface level, and has to be renegotiated entirely, because whatever was negotiated in the post-Second World War consensus no longer holds. Now, is it primarily because of the sort of how the capital order has been structured, as Professor Mattei was talking about it? Or is it because of the exigencies of new things that are coming up? I think it's both. When we talk about sort of decaying political institutions, and largely the point that I was trying to make was that there is so much spillover from the economic side to the policy side and the political side to the perception side, that it is very hard for us to untangle all of this. Now, in the middle of it, you put up the people at the bottom of the pyramid, right? People who are the most vulnerable because of this breakdown of the social contract. Go back to 1940s, 50s. In fact, Bradford DeLong has a fascinating book called Slouching Towards Utopia. And when you read that book, you get this idea that, okay, slowly and steadily we were getting our act together. But in 1950s, you have this idea that with one job, you could have a house and then you could have a mortgage. It was largely a Western world conception, but everybody looked up to it. That is also what the newer emerging economies thought about. So be it China, be it Japan, be it South Korea. But look at the realization today. South Korea is one of the 10 largest economies. I mean, it's one of the matured economies in Asia. And look at their social structure. If it is not collapsing, then it is on the process there. Nikkei has a fascinating article about it yesterday. Look at China. It's a country which is in the middle of the middle income trap, huge infrastructure, mobilization of what can only be called battlefield technology geared towards its own citizenry. Look at Japan. 3 decades of negative inflation, stagflation, suddenly they figured their act together. In all of this, we forget that politicians cannot suddenly replace the capital order. They have to respond to what the people want. And the people are to be informed by the larger institutions that work around them. Never in the history of the world have you had this much information. Never in the history of the world have you been this confused about how to access that information. We are living through times where you have a billionaire who pretends to be a man of the people, right? And gets elected to the highest office in the United States on that particular ticket. And you have another man who might actually be a man of the people, but who's then called an elite and a counter elite and then thrown out. How did we get here? I think the question is that at some point of time, the social contract is broken down, and the trust mechanism has not been redressed. Is it because of economic complexity? Is it because of technological complexity? Is it because of the organizational hierarchy that is broken down? Nobody knows. To add to what Dr. Tiwari was saying, and to make your job slightly more complicated,
But
big
in
tech
the next
companies,
minute or two, please. Sorry.
in the next minute. So big tech companies, they have their own work cut out, so I'm not even going to touch them. But look at big tech government companies. Look at Chinese model of large tech companies that has been taken over in the rest of the developing world. Look at all of the digital public infrastructure which India has created and which India takes a lot of pride in. But end of the day, what is the mechanism through which you're going to enforce trust? Who's looking at this algorithm? Who has access to your data? You're talking about the world's largest democracy, and yet you don't have the basic information about these things publicly available. That's it. Thank you.
Thank you. Dr. Mattei, over to you then.
Thank you very much. Yes, I mean, I think the whole point here is that we need to think about the fact that the social contract was imposed on the majority of people since fundamentally the origins of our economic system. And this is something that then I think is revealed also by the fact that common people actually understand the structural economic violence of our capitalist economy in their daily experience, right? So the problem that also Gramsci was pointing out is that how many people actually live this no, I can't find the word for some reason. Live a common sense that is in a way dual, in the sense that they feel that something is not working, but at the same time they are indoctrinated with the rhetoric that tells them that indeed this is the only and the best system possible, right? So this contradictory common sense, I think, is something that, again, economists should take seriously, because when economic indicators look great, you know, unemployment statistics tell us that unemployment is low, that is inflation is getting tamed. At the same time, people still feel the hardship of their economic conditions on their own skin. And I think this is not because they don't understand economics, but because they actually understand economics much better than those who are privileged enough to have a filter of ideology that comes from the privileged position that the majority of academics or those who lead financial or economic institutions have, right? So going back to taking people's discontent seriously. And in this sense, focusing on the fact that actually, again, there is a tension, and I would even say an incompatibility between democracy and capitalism. And I would just like to qualify this, right? Because indeed, we know that electoral democracy has emerged historically together with capitalism, also as Dr. Tiwari was pointing out. The point here is that electoral democracy is a very superficial understanding of how to run the economy once indeed decisions regarding the most important material conditions of our existence are by definition foreclosed for the majority of people, right? Indeed, there is not a collective decision of how to organize production and distribution that is left in the hands of very few around the world, and in ever lesser hands now that with the asset manager economy, resources and business are getting ever more concentrated, okay? So there's this issue, of course, of the fact that it's vertical relations of production, not horizontal, but then there's also the issue of the fact that the state is, of course, part and parcel of our economy, right? We need to go beyond this false dichotomy between the markets and the states. The markets and the states need one another. And the role of the capitalist state is indeed, as Marxian literature tells you, that of preserving the general interest in the sense of actually maintaining economic growth, otherwise said capital accumulation, sturdy, right? So if this is the role of the capitalist state to maintain economic growth, and this is indeed how we vote for a government, oh, have they been able to indeed deliver on economic success? Well, then we realize that what the state can actually do in terms of policies that are redistributed is very limited, right? It's limited, it's structurally limited. And again, when I say structurally, I mean politically as well, right? Politically and economically limited. So that really this calls into question the false pluralism of so-called liberal democracy, in the sense that if you vote Democrat, if you vote Republican, if you vote right, or if you vote left, what you see is that there is a fundamental unanimous way of managing the economy, which is an economy that has to give priorities, again, the economic priorities overrule people's needs. And this is something that actually technocrats have to defend, because once more, every time people do get a voice, they tend to actually ask for demands that are incompatible with the logic of capitalism. And this is why in my work, I've really studied how important it has been to insulate decision-making processes and economic institutions from people's participation, right? So if you think about independent central banks, if you think about balanced budgets in the Constitution, if you think of the constitutional framework of these capitalist states, they are indeed frameworks that try to detach democratic liability as much as possible. So in this sense, I would just—
Apologies for interrupting, but yeah, in a minute, please.
In a minute, yes. I would just like to qualify with respect to the other speakers. I do think that the idea of idealizing the golden age of capitalism, the 40s and 50s and 60s, as a moment that was qualitatively different, I think is problematic historically. And this is actually the purpose of my next book, is to actually say, well, was it really, were the fundamentals in those years really that different? Or were they not? There's this great book, and I would finish with this, that is out right now with Penguin, called The Rise and Fall of American Finance. And it's a very interesting book because it tries to dispute the conventional narrative by which, we have the real economy and then we have financial economy. And the problem lies in when we delve into a financialized economy, and that's when the problems emerge. This book tries to show that actually finance, and American finance especially, has never been there without the role of the state and without the enmeshing in the real economy, right? So industrial and financial capitalism have always gone hand in hand. And so this helps dismantle a bit the idea that we were living in a different species of capitalism before, and that this is ultimately where we should try to revert back to. I would say we should look forward, not back, once we stop idealizing the past and in general our economic system. Thank you.
Professor Mattei, I do see a number of questions in the chat, some of them directed to specific either speakers or at least themes. So I can call out and point them to speakers. I can also give you all maybe a minute to read, and if you want to pick up on a specific one and respond to it. I would like at least one of you to pick up the question around social media, specifically within technology. I think that should be quite an interesting one. Would anyone like to start in on that one? And then, feel free to call out the question you want to speak to, and we'll just go from there.
I don't mind going for social media.
Please.
So essentially, just to recap, what role does technology, specifically social media, play in building or eroding social capital and trust in modern societies? So specifically, when we are talking about social media, we're talking about large, what economists call platform economies, right? So when you're looking at it from the platform economy perspective, You are the creator and you're also the consumer. To use a very oft-used word produced by the columnist Friedman, you become a prosumer. But in all of this, you are feeding largely to your own sort of echo chamber, and you are existing within a notion, or in sort of, you're building your own knowledge base, and from that knowledge base, you're trying to specifically find that one moment of truth, and you are not expanding the scope of your engagement. If you look at, and this is a fascinating study that I think somebody is doing. I think it's part of some sort of a government work, so I can't really talk about it much. But there is a fascinating work on how different government institutions use social media to talk about their work. So when governments use social media to talk about their work, they're only highlighting the good things that they've done. So any kind of fact-checking mechanism that might have happened ceases off, because the state has the access to the data, but it also has access to the mechanism now to directly disseminate its own version of what it wants the world to see. When it comes to eroding or building trust, I think it's a two-way street, because people respond to, whenever we think about social media, we go back to that pivotal moment in 2008 to 2011, when social media was coming up, and then you had the Arab Spring, and everybody talked about that, how social media can lead to change, right? But if you now go 13 years into the future, 2024, you've had Cambridge Analytica, again, a problem with data. You've had how your data is constantly monitored, how large companies can directly speak to governments, and how larger companies are now, richer or bigger than some countries that they are part of. So how do you kind of disentangle this? It's very, very hard to do. And it has all become part of what is called as spin dictatorship. So you can essentially spin out any narrative, and you cannot be called out on it, because any kind of interaction can be bought, any kind of likes can be bought, any kind of comments can be bought. And it has created an entire virtual economy in its own right, which exists just to feed into a positive picture of what you are. And how do you trust anything? Because remember, since 2016, we apparently live in a post-truth age. So social media is that one barometer that I think is going to be very fascinating when we come and examine economy and economics in the 21st century. And that's the point I was trying to make, because trust is important, because you have to kind of get it back to people to say that, okay, X might not be the truth, but we can extend this argument and take it to someplace. Right now, either it's my way or the highway. That's something that we have to get out of. And without doing that, I don't think we can have economic growth for everybody.
I think to switch up the order from how we're going so far, Professor Mattei, there were a couple of questions specifically, I think, directed to you.
Yes. So there's a question that says that under such conditions, capitalism does not thrive and economies remain poor. So I think part of what I'm trying to push for here is a different lens, right? A different theoretical lens, which ultimately requires also stop thinking about units that are aggregate units, right? The national economy, right? India, China, America, this aggregate, which is a typical lens that economists love, is ultimately, I think, concealing of what ultimately I think has much more more theoretical relevance, which is class analysis, who wins and who loses. It doesn't make sense to speak of India in general. We know that India is a very, very stratified economy, and so as everywhere else in the world. Okay, so there's no such thing as a unity, and this unity ultimately is what hides what really is at stake here, right? That capitalism works for few and doesn't for the many. So we should not think that if capitalism works, everyone is happy. And we should not think that if the economy grows, everyone is happy, especially if this economic growth relies on more precarious, more exploited labor and on low wages, right? So, and this is ultimately what we have seen is the trend for at least the last 50 years. So this, I think, is really where I would like to try to push against. And this allows us to think, okay, so then what are alternatives? And I think this is the real important question that all the young minds, the young scholars should be focused on right now. Once we stop idealizing our capitalist economy, we are emancipated, liberated to think outside of the box. Yes. So, and this is ultimately why my work has been actually now I'm trying to still write a book in history, which is about dismantling the idealization of the Keynesian era. So the post-Second World War II era, which is, I think, still ways against looking forward. But apart from that, how to look forward. And this is, I think, the big thing, because we are used to thinking in this end of history perspective by which all alternatives have been tried, they've failed. Ultimately, revolution is like a bad word because you imagine bloodshed and disaster. Ultimately, revolution is a process. And what it means is fundamentally shaking and overcoming the radically the foundation of our society, namely the pillars of capitalism, which are wage relations and private property of the means of production, right? So a revolutionary outcome would be a society that organizes itself without these two pillars. And this means ultimately doing something that is fundamental, which is overcoming the domination of the value form, right? So if you read an important book, I think that does really good job at explaining what critical political economy means by domination is Michael Heinrich's work on reading Capital. And what you see here is that the idea is that actually our society is a society of domination in which we are ruled by what we have ourselves created, namely the value form, okay? So far from being emancipated from fetishism, we are really within it. And the value form rules not just over workers, but over capitalists as well, right? Real competition means that if you're not able to deliver commodities quickly and at low prices, you lose your business, right? This is why we have seen constant concentration and centralization of resources. So the whole point here is, how do we overcome the rule of the value form? And I think this is where we should stop thinking in abstract terms and think that every small pressure from within the system is already, if ambitious, a step in that direction, right? So fighting against austerity measures for real, not just about budget cuts, but about budget cuts, for example, in the social resources, while money the state is delivering, for example, to the military industrial complex. So serious redistributional fights are fights that are important to put pressure on governments to start thinking beyond the logic of capitalism, to give priority to political needs instead of economic demands, right? So these are ways to shift the boundaries of the possible and open up political imagination. There's a lot of fights to defend the commons. There's a lot of recuperated industries in which workers are ultimately running independently via self-management. Also in agriculture, there's a lot of this happening already, right? Of actually the call for self-management also in agriculture, even in India. So these are all small steps that they'll help open up imagination for novel space, which is not the role of me as a professor to kind of give a recipe to what to do. The point is that if we understand how the system operates and how it's always about political struggle, and that there's no economic necessity that is set in stone, because those economic necessities are constructed collectively, and of course then become real necessity, and says that this is the rule of the value form. If the state does not pay back the debt, it gets backlash from the rest of the capitalist global system, right? This is the domination of the value form. But the whole point here is that once we understand what the problems are, then we can start thinking, how do we consciously produce and distribute resources to actually put fulfillment of needs first? And I think this is really important. There's a whole bunch of literature, but again, I think, as Gramsci told us, what you need to do is experience, participate, and collectively organize. It doesn't happen in the ivory tower of the intellectuals, social transformation. In my own work, last thing I worked on what happened after the First World War. All of my first part of the book is about social alternatives that were real after the First World War, before the austerity agenda took over. So again, looking at history, participating, that's the way to do it. And I think you will be surprised, because there's already a lot of people working in this direction. And it's just a matter for us to give conceptual clarity to these social transformations.
Is there a particular question you'd like to pick up? If not, then I can fall out.
Maybe I want to point to a real live example. I spent a couple of years working with the policymakers in Singapore. So this is a country, population is small, and I recognize that. But this is a country that left Malaysia with unemployment of 40% and a swamp. And today it is a country, on one hand, dominated by the capitalist system, where the allocation of resources are determined by the market, but a maturity in both political and public policy making to ensure that the population is not left behind. Free education and the best education system in the world. Land policy that is the best in the world. Every Singapore citizen has a piece of land, and when prices rise, which they rise in every metropolis, they gain. Low taxes, 12% average tax rate. The highest going up to 15. So there is no incentive to cheat on taxes. Low debt, 0. There is no. So how did a country that started, which was, when it left Malaysia, it was worse off than every country in Asia. It was worse off. And it is a maturity of policy making, which on one hand leads to a creation of value, on second leads to a sharing through a political system, a maturity of a political system where people are not left behind. And I think it is possible to do so. It's an example where you need a bit of balance on both sides, and you don't need to which I don't think will happen, is overturn a system upside down. So there's much to look at live examples that are working, and they're working for a reason, that every increase that happens as development takes place, whether it's land value, financial wealth, that has to be shared. And that has to be shared in a manner that doesn't get you to prohibitive tax rates. Singapore being an example, doesn't get you to inflation, which hits the poor. And that gets you to an outcome where education is key so that average society can move forward. I'd stop here.
Brought up Singapore, and also because Farheen actually had a question in the chat. Let me just ask a related question to you, which is among other countries, Singapore and India are now collaborating on UPI and potentially on other forms of digital public infrastructure. Of course, this is something you were working on during the G20 presidency as well. At best, we think that it can make governance more effective and potentially contribute to better outcomes, and in turn, a better process, more trust, better experiences. What is, again, I think to the point you were making earlier, what is your sense of what is needed for that kind of promise to actually be delivered upon?
So definitely, and if I can just a couple of minutes on it, and definitely what digital public infrastructure has done in India is it has provided opportunities that were never available before. And I'll give you two examples. More than 80%, 85% of the population is inside the financial system. It's been the largest increase that has been visible across countries. The divide between the rich and the poor has narrowed when participating in the financial system. Between the educated and uneducated has been narrowed. Between men and women has narrowed. And so it's done that. It's also led to a decrease in corruption. The biggest part of the Indian budget was transfers that happened in cash before. And for every rupee that was transferred, the ultimate consumer got 45 pesos. So 45% of what was transferred. Today, it is 100%. And so it is bringing people back, but it is not, it is not that easy to do it. And just a single, that in the chat, there was this reference to the Singapore-India UPI example. It took 18 months to do that between two countries that have the most talented minds when it comes to technology. And so one of the areas where future growth will come up, there's, it's without doubt, every study has said that the addition to growth is anywhere from 8 to 15% of GDP, which is huge at this moment of time, is through the use of digital public infrastructure to support growth, support financial intermediation. What technology is able to do is to reduce dependence on older forms or older models that were tilted towards the rich. And so just one example, and I will stop. In India today, there is this whole account aggregator experiment that is going on where millions and millions of people have signed up. And it is trying to see whether it is possible for the financial system to decrease its dependence on physical collateral when loans are being made. So if you think about it, physical collateral, the young don't have it and the poor don't have it, right? So the loans are going to be made in a certain direction, and you're going to have this large part of society that will have to be self-financed and therefore not reach its potential. In the experiment that's going on in India right now, the question asked is, where can information collateral lessen the dependence on physical collateral? And the answer is yes. I think it's those forms that can be beneficial, but technology has to be regulated, because what we've also seen is unregulated, it can go in a direction that can run ahead of society.
Dr. Tiwari. Looking at the time, I think we're at the point where we should do our closing round of remarks with the speakers. So let me do it let me request in the order of Dr. Mattei, then Dr. Tiwari, and then Dr. Rai, maybe as the chair, you can have the last word. What I request each of the speakers to do, so take about 2 to 3 minutes each, and 3 crisp prompts. So one big idea you'd like people to walk away with, one big question that you think we should all think about and work on, and one book recommendation that you think we should, as soon as we leave this webinar, we should go pick up that book and read it. Dr. Mattei, can I ask you to start, please?
So the one question we should go, the first part is one question that we should go about asking. Is that what you said? Sorry, I
no worries. I said one big idea you'd like everyone on the call to walk away with, one big question you think you should be thinking about, and then one book recommendation.
Thank you. So one big idea is, once more, to realize that there is no knowledge that is neutral knowledge, that all knowledge, especially economic knowledge, is political. And this is why we have to be aware of the foundations of the type of knowledge and tradition we are studying in order to problematize its foundations and potentially open up to more courageous ways of critically assessing the present by looking at the foundations of capitalism. So the question I think we should all be working on is indeed, what are alternatives that radically challenge the priorities of the capitalist economy? And I think a book that can be very interesting is the book that I was mentioning before. It's called The Rise and Fall of American Finance. It just came out, and the authors are Stephen Meher and Scott Aquano. The Rise and Fall of American Finance with Penguin University Press. And I think this is one of the books that are very helpful in helping us by having a different interpretation of the history of our economic system, so that we can also use these tools to be critical at the present moment. Thank you.
Dr. Tiwari, over to you.
Yeah, so I think from my side, looking ahead, what is, at least to me, clear is that technology will dominate, and the challenge will be how public policy addresses it, so that the opportunities that it provides are available widely across society. I will not point to a book, but I'll point to a person that lives in India that I think has repeatedly provided answers, which is Nandan Nilekani in Bangalore, who was the architect behind Aadhaar, provided the initial solutions to the UPI system, will fundamentally change the education system in India with the new system that has come out that can do interpretation between 24 Indian languages in real time, so that a child sitting in Assam is able to audit MOOCs from Stanford. I'm just picking up two examples. But that is what providing opportunities means. That is what a mature policy making means. And that is a route that is likely to level the playing field. If you want to read his first book, which was Reimagining India, it's a good one. And the last one, which is how to keep independence from technology as the art of bitfulness. It's another way where he is sort of a technologist, public policy maker is trying to point to both sides of technology.
Okay, I'm presuming so. Last, right. So, well, thank you so much, everybody, for doing it. I was trying out a couple of new ideas, and I think I might be able to write a good paper after this. So, thanks a lot for it. I'm going to credit each and every one of you. So, one big idea. The entire argument that I was trying to make was that we are living in times where it is very easy for us to have trust on an actor. So, what political scientists call actor-based trust. We take an actor, say Mr. Nilekani, and certain inherent qualities, trustworthiness. So we place a lot of trust in the actor, and then anything or everything that the actor does goes. It is in politics, it's in what new people call influencers, it's in actors, sports people, etc. We need to move away from it. If we want democracies to survive, we need to move to system-based trust. System-based trust is eroding very fast all over the world, and it has repercussions. One book that I would like to recommend, there are many, but I think Diane Coyle, an economist, a doyen of economists, wrote a very interesting book called Cogs and Monsters, What Economics Is and What It Should Be. I think that's a recommended reading because a lot of the things and a lot of the next 10, 15 years that we're going to navigate, they're going to be talking very complicated things about unit-based economics from a macro perspective. These two things just don't connect, they don't gel well together. We need to be very, very clear about which economic order are we talking and arguing about. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Rai. Farheen had asked me to summarize this discussion. You can imagine how much of a challenge that it's been a very rich discussion. I think we've covered a lot of terrain. If there were gaps in continuity and if you're leaving with thoughts that we were not able to explore, I apologize, but that is also the nature of this sort of conversation, unless we gave ourselves 6 or 7 hours instead of 90 minutes. I think I come out of the conversation certainly I was aware of this, but I think I come out of the conversation reminded about the fact that that political, social, and economic orders are historically contingent and not necessarily inevitable, right? That we came out of a certain history that has given us the forms of institutions that we have. And at least in theory and research and exploration, there is nothing that stops us from exploring what might be true outside of these, or indeed from rethinking how these might have actually played out. I think there are many lessons that can be drawn from the ways that different societies, different cultures at different points of time have tried to grapple with these fairly fundamental questions of, look, who has the power, who gets to make the decisions, how do we ensure that they're not just enriching themselves and doing harm to the rest of us. There were a couple of questions also in the chat around sort of, multiculturalism and differences in cultural values and valences around trust. As a psychologist by training, I apologize that we were not able to get to those, but there is wonderful literature out there that you can actually read on how different societies think about order, hierarchy, and trust. I think the book recommendations from me, and then I'll hand it back to Farheen, and I will slightly cheat and name 2. One is another classic of economics, which is Schumacher's Small is Beautiful, which I think does a wonderful job of sort of demonstrating some of the various forms of economic order that have developed in the post-World War world. The other is a more recent work by a Harvard professor named Rob Nixon called Slow Violence and the Environmentalism of the Poor, which to take us back to, I think, where Dr. Tiwari started us out, right? Is talking about how people are grappling with the climate crisis as they experience it in their own lives and in their own work. With that, I hope everyone has found this discussion interesting, thought-provoking, hopefully paper-provoking or paper-producing. And with that, let me hand back to Freddie.
Thank you, Mr. Naik. You've done the hard job of summarizing this discussion. So I officially thank our speakers, Professor Rai, Dr. Tiwari, Professor Mattei. Thank you so much for joining us today. And although we could not definitely conclude how trust is built between institutions and how do we achieve a balance between these, or is it even possible? But this just highlights the complexity of the issues we are dealing with. And it is essential to keep this conversation going. And we will be exploring it in our future work as well. We'll be publishing a short note after this based on the discussions we've had. So you can reach out to us at any time.